Somewhere in a museum drawer lies a small gold coin. On one side, there is a king in a heavy nomad coat, flames rising from his shoulders, ringed by letters borrowed from the Greek alphabet. On the other side, standing calmly, is the Buddha, one of the earliest images of him ever struck in metal. One coin, 4 worlds pressed into it: Greece, Persia, India, and the steppe. The people who made it ruled an empire most of us have never heard of. They built no Colosseum. They left almost no chronicle of their own. And yet, without them, Buddhism might never have found its road into China, and from there to Korea and Japan. Tonight we follow a defeated tribe of refugees across 3,000 miles, and watch them become the quiet hinge on which half the ancient world turned. Get comfortable. Let the day go. The story begins with a lost people running west. Chapter 1. The people without a country. Every empire has a beginning, and most beginnings are flattering. A founding hero, a prophecy, a city rising where lightning struck the earth. The Kushan Empire begins with none of that. It begins with a defeat so complete that the losers had to leave their entire world behind. To find that beginning, we have to travel to a place most maps of the ancient world barely bother to label: a long, narrow corridor of grassland and desert in what is now northwestern China, squeezed between mountains to the south and the great emptiness of the Gobi to the north. Today, it is called the Gansu Corridor. Stand there at dawn, and you understand at once why people fought over it. To the south rise the Kilian Mountains, white with snow, even in high summer, and their meltwater comes down in cold, quick streams that turn the desert's edge into a chain of green oases, like stepping stones laid across 1,000 miles of dry country. Whoever holds those stepping stones holds the only comfortable road between China and everything that lies west of China. 2,200 years ago, that road belonged to a people the Chinese records call the Yuezhi. Almost everything we know about the early Yuezhi comes from Chinese historians, and it is worth pausing on that, because it shapes this entire story. The Yuezhi did not write their own history, not at this stage, and barely ever. They are one of those peoples we can only see through the eyes of their neighbours. The way you might learn about a family down the street only from what the other neighbours say. The most important of those neighbours was a court historian of the Han dynasty named Sima Qian, who finished his great work, The Records of the Grand Historian, around the year 90 BC. When this chapter tells you what the Yuezhi did, it is largely Sima Qian talking, and we should remember that he was describing outsiders from a distance. For his own emperor, what he describes is this: the Yuezhi were headers, horses, cattle, sheep. They moved with the seasons, the way steppe peoples had moved for thousands of years. But they were not poor wanderers. They sat on one of the most valuable trade routes on earth, the road along which jade from the Tarim Basin flowed east into China, where it was prized above almost everything, carved into the emblems of kings and buried with the honored dead. Chinese sources suggest the Yuezhi grew wealthy on that trade, and strong. For a time, they may have been the dominant power of the eastern steppe. Neighboring tribes sent them hostages as a guarantee of good behavior. One of those hostages was a young man from a rival people called the Xiongnu. His name was Modu. If you remember one name from this chapter, let it be that one, because Modu is the reason everything that follows ever happened. According to Sima Qian, Modu escaped from the Yuezhi, returned home, and seized power over the Xiongnu by force, and the historian preserves a story about how he did it. A story that, whether or not every detail is literal, tells us exactly how the steppe remembered this man, Modu. The account goes, devised a whistling arrow, an arrowhead drilled through so that it screamed in flight. And he trained his horsemen to loose their own arrows instantly at whatever his whistling arrow struck. He tested them on his finest horse. Some of his men hesitated, and did not live to hesitate twice. He tested them again and again, on targets ever closer to the unthinkable, until the day came when he turned the whistling arrow on his own father, the reigning ruler of the Xiongnu, and 1,000 bows released as one. That is the man the Yuezhi had once held as a hostage boy. Sima Qian recorded the tale, dark as it is, because it explained something his readers needed to understand. The Xiongnu had acquired a leader of total will, and the comfortable world of the Gansu corridor was about to end. Modu organized the tribes. He built an army of mounted archers that even the Chinese Empire learned to fear, and he did not forget the people who had held him hostage. Around the year 176 BC, the blow fell. Modu's armies crushed the Yuezhi in their homeland, and in a letter to the Han court that Sima Qian preserves, the Xiongnu ruler boasted of the victory. Then, a decade or so later, in the 160s BC, under Modu's son and successor, a ruler the Chinese call the Laoshang Chanyu, came the humiliation that echoes through the sources. The Yuezhi king was killed in battle, and Sima Qian records that the Xiongnu ruler had the dead king's skull made into a drinking cup. Stay with that image for a moment, because the ancient world certainly did. A king reduced to a cup at his enemy's feast. Whether every detail is literally true, we cannot verify. But the Chinese court believed it. And decades later, that single detail would change the history of Asia. Because the Han emperor would assume that a people so humiliated must be burning for revenge. That assumption, as we will see in the next chapter, launches one of the most consequential diplomatic missions ever attempted. But for the Yuezhi themselves, in that moment, there was no grand story. There was only a choice that no settled nation ever has to make in quite the same way. Stay and be absorbed or destroyed, or take the herds, the children, the elderly, everything that could walk or be carried, and leave forever. They left. Not all of them. The Chinese records preserve a detail that makes the story more human, not less. A part of the people, remembered in the sources as the lesser Yuezhi, could not make the journey, or would not, and instead moved south into the Qilian Mountains to live among the Qiang tribes, keeping the old name in the old country for centuries after the rest had gone. Every migration in history has this second half, the ones who stay behind, and history, which follows the movers, almost never tells us how their story felt from the inside. When this video says the Yuezhi, it means the ones who walked, the greater Yuezhi of the records. But somewhere in the mountains above the corridor, a remnant kept the name and kept the graves. Now think about what the walking actually means. We use the word migration casually, but this was a nation in motion, tens of thousands of people, perhaps more, moving west with their animals through country that already belonged to someone else. There was no empty land waiting for them. Every valley they entered was somebody's home. So the Yuezhi migration was not a journey so much as a slow chain reaction of displacement, each people pushing the next, like beads on a string. The Chinese sources let us follow the outline of it. The main body of the Yuezhi moved first into the Ili River Valley, a green and generous country in what is now Kazakhstan and western China, to live there. They drove out a people called the Sakas, horse nomads related to the Scythians, who fled south and would themselves reshape the history of Iran and India. Remember the Sakas. They will cross this story again. For a while. The Ili Valley must have felt like safety. It was not. Another people, the Wusun, who had their own old scores to settle and the backing of the Xiongnu, attacked the Yuezhi in their new home and broke them a second time. Twice defeated, twice uprooted. The Yuezhi moved again, further west and further south, until by roughly 130 BC they arrived at the banks of a great river the Greeks called the Oxus, in the land the Greeks called Bactria, in what is today Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. There, at last, the running stopped. And here the story asks something of us. A small turn of the mind that changes the whole picture. History, as it is usually taught, is written from the winner's chair. We remember Modu and the Xiongnu as the great steppe power of the age. And they were, but follow the consequences far enough, and the picture inverts. The Xiongnu Empire would eventually fragment and fade. The refugees they created would build a state that reshaped the religious map of the entire Eastern Hemisphere. The cup made from a king's skull has vanished. The consequences of the people who fled from it are sitting, right now, in every Buddhist temple in China, Korea, and Japan. Defeat, in other words, is not the end of a people's story. Sometimes it is the mechanism by which their story becomes important. The Yuezhi mattered to world history precisely because they lost, because losing put them in motion, and motion carried them to the one place on earth where four civilizations stood within reach of each other. There is one more thread to pick up before this chapter closes, and it is a quiet one. Far to the east, in the Han capital, reports of the Yuezhi defeat were being read with great interest. The Chinese Empire was locked in its own exhausting struggle with the Xiongnu, paying tribute, losing border towns, running out of options, and somewhere, in that court, an idea took shape. If the Yuezhi hated the Xiongnu as much as a people surely must hate the makers of that terrible cup, then perhaps, far away in the west, China had an ally it had never met. All they needed was someone willing to cross thousands of miles of hostile, unmapped country to go and find them. A volunteer stepped forward. A palace attendant, largely unknown, named Zhang Qian. His journey will take 13 years, cost him a decade in captivity, and fail completely at its stated purpose. It will also, almost by accident, open the road we now call the Silk Road, and stitch the halves of the ancient world together. That journey is where we go next. For now, picture the Yuezhi at the end of their long flight, standing on the north bank of the Oxus River, looking south at the green hills of Bactria. They do not know it yet. But on the other side of that river waits the strangest thing a steppe people could imagine. A Greek kingdom. At the end of the world. The herds are quiet now. The river moves, in the dark. Rest easy. The story will still be here. Chapter 2. The Envoy Who Walked for 13 Years. Around the year 138 BC, in the Han capital of Chang'an, a notice went up at the imperial court. The emperor was looking for a volunteer. The mission was simple to describe and almost impossible to survive. Someone had to travel west, beyond the edge of every Chinese map, find the defeated Yuezhi people wherever they had gone, and convince them to return east and join China in a war against the Xiongnu. Between the volunteer and the Yuezhi lay thousands of miles of desert and mountain, and nearly all of it was controlled by the Xiongnu themselves. The man who stepped forward was a palace attendant named Zhang Qian. We know his story because Sima Qian, the same court historian we met in the last chapter, recorded it in detail in the records of the Grand Historian, and it is worth saying plainly that this is one of the best documented journeys in the entire ancient world. We are not guessing here. We have the historian's account, written within living memory of the events, based on the reports Jiang Qian himself brought home. Jiang Qian left Chang'an with about 100 men and a guide named Gan Fu. The plan was to slip quietly through Xiongnu territory. The plan failed almost immediately. The Xiongnu captured the entire mission and brought Jiang Qian before their ruler, who asked a question that has a certain undeniable logic to it. Sima Qian records the sense of it this way: the Yuezhi lie to the north and west of us. What would China say if I sent my envoys through China to reach a country on your far side? The Xiongnu did not execute Jiang Qian. They simply kept him. They gave him a Xiongnu wife. He had a son. Seasons turned into years, and years into a decade. And here is the first remarkable thing about this man. 10 years is long enough to forget any mission. He had a family now, a life, a place in the world of his captors. Sima Qian notes one detail with quiet admiration. Through all those years, Jiang Qian kept the emperor's staff of authority, the physical token of his mission, and never let it go. When the watch on him finally relaxed, he escaped, and instead of fleeing east toward home, he turned west and kept going, deeper into the unknown, still trying to complete a mission 10 years dead. What he found on the far side of the mountains astonished him. He passed through the Fergana Valley, a rich land the Chinese would call Daiyuan, famous for horses, so fine the Han would later fight wars to obtain them. He passed through the lands of the Kangju, and at last, somewhere around 128 BC, he reached the banks of the Oxus River and found the people he had crossed a continent to find. The Yuezhi were not waiting for him. That is the quiet tragedy and the quiet comedy of this whole story. The Han court had built its entire strategy on the memory of the Skull Cup, on the assumption that a people so humiliated must dream of revenge. But more than a generation had passed. The Yuezhi now held the richest land they had ever known. The grass was good. The trade was better. The Xiongnu were a nightmare from their grandparents' time, 3,000 miles away. Jiang Qian stayed with them about a year, arguing for war, and the answer never changed. Sima Qian summarizes it with the phrase that they had no intention of taking revenge. So Jiang Qian turned around and went home. He tried a different route, along the southern edge of the desert, and was captured by the Xiongnu again. He escaped again, this time during a succession struggle after the death of the Xiongnu ruler. In the year 126 BC, 13 years after he left, Jiang Qian walked back into Chang'an. Of the roughly 100 men who had set out with him, 2 came home, Jiang Qian and the guide Ganfu. Try to stand at the city gate for that homecoming. No crowd was waiting, because no one counts the days of a mission 13 years dead. A man in worn felt and cracked leather, aged by desert and captivity, walks up to the walls of the greatest city in Asia and tells a bewildered gatekeeper that he is the emperor's envoy to the Yuezhi. Return to report. He is still carrying the staff. Beside him, by Sima Qian's account, stand the 2 people who made the return possible. His Xiongnu wife, who left her entire world to follow his, and Ganfu, the guide, who had kept the starving party alive in the wastelands with his bow. History rarely lets us see faces. Here, for a single moment at a city gate, it almost does. Judged by its stated purpose, the mission was a total failure. No alliance, no war in the West. 13 years and 98 lives for a polite refusal. And yet historians sometimes describe this journey as one of the hinges of world history. To see why, forget the treaty that never happened, and look at what Jiang Qian actually carried home. Information. He had seen, with his own eyes, a chain of civilized kingdoms stretching west beyond the desert. Kingdoms with cities and markets and irrigated fields. Kingdoms that had never appeared in any Chinese record. He reported on Fergana and its horses. He reported on Bactria, where the Yuezhi now lived. He even reported, secondhand, on a distant land called Anxi, which was Parthian Persia, and on rumours of lands beyond that. And he noticed one small thing that changed everything. In the markets of Bactria, Jiang Qian saw bamboo canes and cloth that he recognized as products of Sichuan, in southwestern China. He asked how they had gotten there, and was told they came through a land called Shendu, which is India. Sit with what that means. Chinese goods were already flowing across the world, through middlemen, along routes no Chinese official had ever seen. The world was already connected. China just had not known it. When Emperor Wu heard all this, the purpose of Chinese policy in the West shifted. If the Yuezhi would not be allies, the routes themselves were the prize. In the decades that followed, Han armies pushed the Xiongnu back, and Han outposts crept west along the corridor of oases, and caravans began to move under official protection. The road that resulted, the road that would carry silk west and gold east, and eventually carry Buddhism into China, is the road we now call the Silk Road. It exists, in the form history knows it, because a failed diplomat kept walking. Sima Qian reached for a memorable phrase to describe what this one man had done. He wrote that Jiang Qian had pierced open the road to the western regions, chiseled it open, the way you might cut a passage through solid rock. The historian was not usually given to drama. He understood that something permanent had changed, and the changes arrived in homely forms as well as grand ones. The records of the grand historian note that envoys returning from the west brought back seeds, and that the emperor had grapevines and alfalfa planted in rich soil near his palaces. Alfalfa, the finest horse fodder on earth. The grape, which the Chinese would learn to press into wine 2,000 years later. Both plants are so thoroughly at home in China that hardly anyone thinks of them as immigrants. Every vineyard in the Gansu corridor today is, in a quiet way, a footnote to Jiang Qian's walk. Jiang Qian himself was not finished walking. In 119 BC, the emperor sent him west a second time, at the head of a far grander mission. 300 men, thousands of animals, bales of silk and measures of gold, bound for the Wusun in the Ili Valley, the very people who had once helped break the Yuezhi. The hope, once again, was an alliance. The result, once again, was polite hesitation. But this time, the road did not close behind the mission. Jiang Qian's deputy envoys fanned out from the Ili Valley to Fergana, to Bactria, to Parthia, and kingdom after kingdom sent envoys and gifts back toward China. Among the gifts came horses of a quality the Chinese had never seen. Animals the court came to call heavenly horses. The name tells you everything about the impression they made. Within a generation, Chinese armies would march all the way to Fergana in pursuit of those horses, and the road west would never again be allowed to fall silent. Jiang Qian died soon after that second journey, honoured with the office his countrymen rendered as great traveller, the master of the empire's envoys. Few men in history have earned a title so literally. There is a lesson folded inside this that reaches well past the 2nd century BC. We tend to measure journeys by whether they achieve what they set out to achieve. But the most consequential outcomes of any great effort are often the ones nobody planned. Jiang Qian went looking for an army and found a world. The Han court sought a weapon against the Xiongnu and instead acquired a window, and through that window, over the next 3 centuries. Would come horses, and grapes, and glass, and gods. The Yuezhi, comfortable on their river, drop out of the Chinese records for a while. But something was happening on that river, in the silence. The Yuezhi had not simply settled in Bactria, they were absorbing it. And being absorbed by it, because the land they now ruled was not empty grassland. It was one of the strangest and most sophisticated places on earth. A place where the people argued philosophy, in Greek, 2,000 miles from Greece. To understand the empire the Yuezhi are about to build, we first have to understand the extraordinary inheritance they were sitting on. We have to visit the Greek kingdom at the end of the world. The Envoy is home now. The lamps of Chang'an are going out, one by one. Breathe slowly. The road will wait for us. Chapter 3. A Greek Kingdom at the End of the World. In the year 1964, French archaeologists began digging at a remote site in northeastern Afghanistan, near the meeting of 2 rivers, at a place the local people called I Khanum. What they uncovered over the following decade sounded, at first report, like a mistake in the paperwork. A Greek city. A complete Greek city, with a theatre and a gymnasium and colonnaded courtyards, temples and administrative palace, 2,500 miles from Athens. The theatre alone could seat thousands. Its stone tiers built into the hillside facing the river, the largest structure of its kind anywhere in Central Asia. Someone had expected audiences here, evening after evening, for tragedy and comedy in Greek. Within sight of the mountains of Afghanistan, and in the ruins, carved in stone, they found Greek maxims, wisdom sayings of the kind inscribed at the sanctuary of Delphi in Greece itself. One inscription recorded that a man named Clearchos had copied these sayings at Delphi and carried them here, to the edge of the known world, so that they could be set up in this city too. As a child, show yourself well-behaved. As a young man, self-controlled. In middle age, just. In old age, a good counselor. At death, without sorrow. Someone carried those words 4,000 miles on foot and by horse, because he believed a city was not complete without them. And the deeper the excavators went, the stranger the familiarity became. They found a sundial of a type used by Greek astronomers, but calibrated, the specialists concluded, for latitudes far from Greece. An instrument of Greek science adjusted for Afghan skies. In the gymnasium, they found a dedication to Hermes and Heracles, the traditional patron gods of Greek athletic education. Exactly what you would expect, scratched into a wall in Corinth. And in the treasury, they found the ghost of a book. Papyrus does not survive the climate of Central Asia, but ink can outlive its page, pressed into the dried mud where a scroll had rotted away. The ink of the vanished text remained legible, and it turned out to be a work of Greek philosophy, a dialogue in the tradition of Aristotle's school, discussing the theory of ideas. Someone in this city, on the banks of the Oxus, had owned serious philosophy and read it seriously. The book died here. The imprint kept its voice. This chapter is about how that city came to exist, and what happened when the Yuezhi arrived at its gates. The story starts, as so much does, with Alexander of Macedon. In the 320s BC, Alexander conquered the Persian Empire and pushed his exhausted army all the way into Bactria and beyond, into the valleys of what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia. He founded cities as he went and settled Greek and Macedonian veterans in them. Then he died, young in Babylon, and his generals carved up the world, and Bactria fell to the dynasty of Seleucus, ruling from distant Mesopotamia. Distance did its quiet work. Around the year 250 BC, the Greek governor of Bactria, a man named Diodotus, stopped taking orders and started minting coins with his own face on them, which is the ancient world's way of declaring independence. The kingdom he founded, which historians call the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, would last in one form or another for 2 centuries. Classical authors, including the geographer Strabo, described Bactria as a land of 1,000 cities, and while that number is surely a flourish, the archaeology confirms a country that was rich, urban, and startlingly Greek in its habits. Rich enough, in fact, to produce the single most extravagant coin to survive from the entire ancient world. One of the later Bactrian kings, Eucratides, struck a gold piece of 20 staters, a disc of solid gold weighing about 169 grams, nearly the weight of 40 modern quarters, stamped with his portrait in a plumed helmet. A single specimen survives, and it sits today in the National Coin Collection in Paris. Numismatists still debate what such a monster coin was for. A royal gift, a display piece, a payment too important for ordinary money. Whatever the answer, remember what it proves. At the far eastern edge of the Greek world, 2,000 miles past the horizon of Athens, there was a king who could afford to show off in 6 ounces of gold. But Bactria was never only Greek, and everything that follows tonight turns on that fact. The kings were Greek. The coin inscriptions were Greek. The gymnasium culture was Greek. Underneath and around all of it lived Bactrians, Persians, Sogdians, and Indians, worshipping their own gods, speaking their own languages, farming land that had been irrigated for 1,000 years before Alexander was born. Greek rule here was a layer, not a replacement. Bactria, in this era, was already doing, on a small scale, the thing the Kushans would later do on a vast one. It was holding several civilizations in one hand. Nowhere is that clearer than in the strangest career this kingdom produced. In the early 2nd century BC, Greco-Bactrian kings crossed the Hindu Kush mountains and invaded northern India. One of the rulers who followed them, a king named Menander, reigned over a Greek kingdom inside India around the middle of that century. And Menander did something no one in Athens could have imagined. According to Buddhist tradition, he engaged deeply with Buddhist teaching, and his conversations with a monk named Nagasena were preserved in a Buddhist text called the Milinda Panha, the Questions of King Milinda, in which a Greek king debates the nature of the self with a Buddhist sage. We should be careful here, as the text was written down later and shaped by the tradition that preserved it, but its very existence tells us something solid. Greek power and Buddhist thought had met, and found each other interesting. There is even a report of how Menander's story ended, and it comes not from a Buddhist source, but from a Greek one. The essayist Plutarch, writing far away in the Roman world, records that when Menander died, the cities of his kingdom competed for the honor of his ashes, and settled the dispute by dividing the remains among themselves. Each city raising its own monument. Plutarch is writing long after the fact, and scholars note how closely the scene echoes the stories told about the relics of the Buddha himself, divided among cities and enshrined. Perhaps that echo is the point. In the country Menander ruled, even a Greek king's memory had begun to be honored in an Indian way. Remember that meeting. The Kushans will build a world religion on the ground it prepared. Back north of the mountains, the Greek kingdom was running out of time. It had every gift except cohesion. Rival kings fought each other for the throne. The wars in India drained men south and out on the steppe. The chain reaction we followed in Chapter 1 was rolling toward them. People pushing, people pushing, people. with the Yuezhi at the far end of the chain. The blow seems to have come in stages. And here the sources grow thin. So this account stays careful. Around 145 BC, the city at Ai-Khanum was violently destroyed, its treasury looted, its palaces burned, and it was never truly rebuilt. Greek historians blamed nomad invasions for the fall of Bactria, and they name peoples who are almost certainly the Sakas, the very tribes the Yuezhi had displaced from the Ili Valley years before. First came the people the Yuezhi had pushed. Then came the Yuezhi themselves, settling the north bank of the Oxus, then crossing it, until, by roughly 120 BC, the heartland of the old Greek kingdom was theirs. Now notice what did not happen next. Because in the long run, it mattered more than any conquest. The Yuezhi did not burn what they found. They moved into it. They took over the irrigated valleys, the caravan cities, the mints. Within a generation, they were striking coins in imitation of Greek coins, with Greek letters on them, because that was the language of money in the world they now owned. The nomads had conquered a civilization. And then, calmly and without any recorded drama, they enrolled in it. Chinese records give us the political shape of what followed. The Hao Han Shu, the official history of the later Han dynasty, reports that the Yuezhi in Bactria were organized into 5 chiefdoms, 5 divisions, each under a lord, bearing the title of Saihao, which scholars usually render as Yabgu, 5 tribes, or 5 districts, side by side in the conquered land. None of them supreme. For about a century, that is how things stayed. 5 chiefdoms, quietly growing rich on the caravan trade, quietly learning Greek bookkeeping and Bactrian farming, quietly forgetting they had ever been refugees. The name of one of those 5 chiefdoms was Guishuang. Say it a little differently. Roll it through a few languages and a few centuries, and it becomes the name this whole story carries. Kushan, 1 tribe out of 5. In the next chapter, a man will rise from that tribe, swallow the other 4, and start an empire. The Greek city sleeps under its hill in Afghanistan. The maxims of Delphi lie face up under the soil, still legible after 2,000 years. Somewhere beneath the treasury floor, the imprint of a philosophy book is still arguing quietly about the nature of ideas. Let them rest there a while longer. Rest with them. Chapter 4. Kujula. 5 tribes become one. The founder of the Kushan Empire died an old man. The Chinese records say he lived past the age of 80. Hold on to that detail, because it is the key to his entire story. We are used to empire builders who burn fast and die young. Alexander was gone at 32. Kujula Kadphises built his empire the other way. Slowly, patiently, over a reign so long that men who were born under 5 separate chiefdoms died as subjects of a single king. His weapon was not genius on the battlefield. His weapon was time. Nearly everything the written record tells us about him comes from one remarkable passage in the Hao Han Shu, the official history of the later Han dynasty, compiled in the 5th century from earlier reports. It is worth being honest about what that means. Our best account of the founding of a Central Asian empire was written by Chinese historians, working from the files of Chinese envoys, describing events that had happened far away and long before. The outline it gives us is precious. The silences around it are enormous. Here is the outline. More than 100 years after the Yuezhi settled in Bactria, the lord of the chiefdom, called Guishuang, a man the Chinese record as Chujuk, attacked and destroyed the other 4 chiefdoms and made himself king. His people came to be known by the name of his own division, Guishuang, which the Western world would render as Kushan. The Chinese, the historian notes, with a certain bureaucratic stubbornness, went on calling them the Great Yuezhi anyway. Kuzhuk is the man we know as Kujula Kadphises, and scholars generally place his rise in the first half of the 1st century AD, at almost exactly the moment, on the far side of the world, when the Roman Empire was passing from Augustus to his successors. How does one lord, out of 5, swallow the other 4? The honest answer is that we do not know the details, and this chapter will not invent battles for you. But we are not entirely without eyes on this world, because archaeology has given us one extraordinary glimpse of the Kushan clan on the eve of its rise, at a place called Kalchayan, in the hills of southern Uzbekistan. Soviet archaeologists, excavating in the 1960s, uncovered a small palace of the Yuezhi era, and inside it the remains of painted clay sculptures that once lined the reception hall. They are portraits, a ruling family and its retainers, modelled from life or close to it. Men with strong cheekbones and steady eyes and the long coats of the steppe. Some faces so individual that scholars are confident they show real people, a dynasty presenting itself to visitors. Most specialists connect Kalchayan with the early Kushan clan itself. If they are right, then, in a museum in Tashkent today, you can stand in front of the actual faces of the family. This chapter is about looking back at you across 2,000 years, from the years just before they mattered to anyone but themselves. The coins let us watch the next part, and they let us watch a mind at work. Kujula struck coins for decades, and their designs tell a story of deliberate, almost studious borrowing. Some of his early coins copy the portraits of the last Greek king in the Kabul Valley, a ruler named Hermaeus, so closely that for a long time collectors could hardly tell them apart. Think about what that means. The new nomad power did not announce itself by erasing the old order. It printed itself into the old order, borrowing the face of a dead Greek king, because that face was what the markets trusted. Then, on other issues, something even stranger appears. Numismatists, the scholars who spend their lives reading coins, have long noted that certain coins of Kujula carry a portrait in the unmistakable style of a Roman emperor, a head widely compared to the coin portraits of Augustus, with a Roman-style seated figure on the reverse, a king descended from steppe refugees, ruling in Afghanistan, advertising himself in the visual language of Rome. Roman coins were arriving in the region through trade, as we will see in the next chapter, and Kujula clearly knew exactly what a trusted currency looked like to a merchant weighing silver in a border town. And on some of his coins, written in the local Kharoshthi script, appears a title that has intrigued historians ever since. A phrase usually read as steadfast in the Dharma. Some scholars take this as a sign of early Kushan sympathy toward Buddhism or toward Indian religious ideas generally. Others urge caution, since royal titles flatter many audiences at once. We will let the question stand open, exactly as the evidence leaves it. But notice the pattern forming: a Greek face for the bazaar, a Roman face for the trade routes, an Indian phrase for the south. This is not confusion. This is a policy. Watch the policy work. At ground level, in a market town in the Kabul Valley, a wool merchant takes a copper coin in change and turns it over without thinking, the way people have checked money in every century. The face on it is a king, and the king looks familiar. And familiar is all the merchant needs. He does not know that the Greek kingdom is gone. He does not particularly care that the men collecting taxes at the gate now wear steppe coats and speak something that is not Greek. The coin still spends. The road is safer than his father remembered it. Whoever this new king is, the merchant has already accepted him. in the only referendum that ancient rulers ever really faced. The moment a stranger decides whether to trust the money, multiply that shrug of acceptance by 1,000,000 market days, and you have watched an empire being founded. The Hao Han Shu gives us the campaign map in a few brisk lines. Kujula invaded Anxi, meaning the Parthian frontier lands, and took the region of Gaofu, which is the Kabul Valley. He destroyed the kingdoms of Puda and Jibin, which scholars place in the borderlands of what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. By the time the old man died, the Kushans had done the thing that changes everything in the history of Central Asia. They had crossed the Hindu Kush and planted themselves on both sides of the mountains at once. Pause here and take the measure of what crossing those mountains means. On foot, with an army, with a state. The Hindu Kush is a wall of rock and ice running 400 miles across the middle of this story, with peaks higher than anything in Europe or the lower 48 states. The passes that thread it climb higher than the summit of most American mountains, and they are open for only part of the year. Caravans move through them single file, animals roped nose to tail, drivers watching the sky, because a storm in the wrong week could close a pass and everything in it. The name itself is grim in most explanations, and travelers across the centuries agreed on the essential point. This was a place that killed the unprepared. To rule on both sides of that wall, to move soldiers and tax collectors and couriers through it on schedule, season after season, was not a boast. It was one of the hardest administrative feats attempted anywhere in the ancient world. That is why Kujula's real conquest was not any single kingdom. Empires of the steppe normally lived north of the mountain wall. Empires of India normally lived south of it. The wealth of the age flowed through the passes between them, and whoever held both ends of the passes held the toll gate of the world. Kujula had taken the doorway between civilizations, and from now on, his family owned the door. There is a human way to say the same thing. A people who had once been driven out of every home, they had now controlled the roads by which everyone else's goods, gods, and letters had to travel. The refugees had become the landlords of the crossroads. When Kujula died, past 80, the Hu Hanshu records that his son took the throne and pushed the frontier deeper into India, conquering Tianzhu, the Chinese name for the Indian Northwest, and installing a general to govern it. And here, the trail enters a fog that would take historians 19 centuries to see through. Because at exactly this point in the coin record, a strange ruler appears. Across northern India and Bactria, in enormous quantities, archaeologists and collectors kept finding coins of a king who refused to give his name. The coins carry a portrait with a tall diadem, rays of light around the head, and a Greek title that translates as Saviour, Great Saviour, King of Kings. No personal name, nothing else. For more than a century of modern scholarship, this ruler was a genuine mystery, filed in the catalogues under his title, Soter Megas, the Great Saviour, an emperor of vast reach who had somehow neglected to tell anyone who he was. Scholars proposed almost every candidate the sources offered. The debate would only be settled, as we will see in Chapter 7, by a broken stone in an Afghan hillside, which revealed that the nameless Great Saviour was Kujula's son and successor, Vima Taktu, the conqueror the Chinese had described all along. Keep the puzzle in mind. It is a perfect miniature of Kushan history itself. An empire hiding in plain sight, wearing a title instead of a name, waiting for one inscription to give it back its identity. For now, the picture at the founder's death is this: on a dynasty, both sides of the mountains, a currency the markets trusted, and a treasury filling with the tolls of the caravan trade. In the next chapter, we leave the kings for a moment and follow the money itself, out along the roads, to see exactly what was moving through the Kushan toll gate, and why a philosopher in Rome was complaining bitterly about the cost of it. The old king is buried. The passes he captured are silent under the stars, waiting for the morning caravans. Let the mountains hold the story for tonight. Chapter 5. The Roads Between Four Empires. In Rome, in the 70s AD, a scholar named Pliny the Elder sat down to finish the great encyclopedia he called the Natural History, and somewhere in its pages he paused to complain about money. By the lowest reckoning, he wrote, India and the Chinese and the Arabian Peninsula together drain 100 million sesterces from our empire every year. That, he added, with an almost audible sigh, is what our luxuries and our women cost us. 100 million sesterces, a sum in the range of a full Roman legion's annual cost many times over, flowing east year after year, paid out for silk, for pepper, for gems and perfumes and ivory. Pliny meant it as a moral scolding. Read today. It is something better. It is a receipt. It is the Roman Empire itself confirming, in writing, that a river of gold was running east across the ancient world. This chapter is about the riverbed that gold ran through, because for a long stretch of its journey, the riverbed had one owner, and that owner was the Kushan Empire. Look at the map of the world around 100 AD, and you see something that had never existed before and would not exist again for a very long time. Four great powers, standing in an unbroken line from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Rome, around the Mediterranean. Parthian Persia, across Mesopotamia and Iran. The Kushans, from Central Asia into northern India. Han China, from the Yellow River to the Tarim Basin. For the first time in human history, you could travel from London to the Pacific coast of China and spend the entire journey inside the borders of just 4 states. Now clear away the most romantic misunderstanding about the Silk Road, because the truth is more interesting. Almost nobody walked the whole road. There was no caravan that loaded silk in a Chinese city and unloaded it in Rome. The road was a relay. Chinese merchants carried goods to the oasis towns of the Tarim Basin. Sogdian and Bactrian traders carried them over the mountains. Kushan subjects carried them down through the passes to the Indus, where goods could continue overland through Persia or, increasingly, sail from ports on the Indian coast, riding the monsoon winds west toward Egypt and the Roman world. A bale of silk might change hands a dozen times, and every single handoff happened in somebody's marketplace, under somebody's taxes. Come stand in one of those marketplaces for a moment, in a caravan town in the Kushan passes. Late in the afternoon, the light is going amber on the mud brick walls. You can hear it before you see it. The bells of a camel train coming down from the north. 60 animals swaying under bales sewn into hides. In the courtyard of the caravanserai, the smells layer over each other. Dung, smoke and dust. Vitvol. And underneath it all, a thread of something sweet and foreign. Pepper and frankincense, leaking from a split sack. A Sogdian trader argues in 3 languages at once. A money changer sits cross-legged behind a small scale. And all afternoon, coin by coin, the scale does not stop moving. This town produces almost nothing. This town is rich beyond the dreams of kings, because everything on earth passes through it. The Kushans sat on more of those towns, more of those scales, than anyone else. The overland roads from China toward India ran through their passes. The roads from India toward Persia ran through their valleys. A Greek language merchant's handbook of this era, known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, describes the busy port of Barbaricon at the mouth of the Indus and lists what flowed through it. Chinese silk and furs, coming down from the north. Turquoise and lapis lazuli from the mountains. And costly vessels of silver and wine and glass coming in from the west. The handbook is a working document, written by and for traders. And that is exactly why historians trust it. Nobody flatters a customs house. The sea lanes left their own trail of evidence, and it is made of money. Along the coasts of India, farmers and construction crews have been turning up hoards of Roman gold and silver for 2 centuries now. Buried jars of aurei and denarii. So many that Indian museums hold some of the finest collections of Roman coinage outside Europe. Greek and Roman writers explained how the coins got there. Sailors had learned the secret of the monsoon. The great seasonal wind that blows steadily toward India for half the year and back toward Africa for the other half. And a ship that had once crept along the coastline for months could now run straight across the open ocean in a few weeks. Pliny, our indignant accountant, records the route and the sailing times himself. The world was not only connected by passes and caravans, it was connected by weather, on a schedule, twice a year. If you want to see the proof in physical form, it exists. And it was found in a single pair of sealed rooms. In the late 1930s, French archaeologists excavating at Begram, north of Kabul, at a site connected with the Kushan summer capital of Kapisa, opened 2 storerooms that had been walled up in antiquity and never reopened. Inside, packed together in one place, lay painted glass from Roman Egypt and Syria, bronzes in the Greek and Roman style, lacquered boxes from Han China, and hundreds of carved ivories from India. One building, in one Kushan city, holding the luxury goods of 4 civilizations at once. Scholars still debate whether it was a royal treasure or a merchant's warehouse. And for our purposes, the debate hardly matters. Either answer proves the same point. Everything met here. And the reach of the crossroads ran further than the mountains. Follow the road northeast out of the Kushan passes, and you come to the string of oasis kingdoms rimming the Tarim Basin, the stepping stones toward China, and there the Kushan fingerprints turn up, both in the histories and in the ground. The Hao Hanshu records the Kushans reaching into the politics of Kashgar, the westernmost of the oasis kingdoms, escorting a prince they had held as a hostage back home and installing him on its throne. And centuries later, when explorers and archaeologists dug the abandoned towns along the basin's southern rim, at sites like Nia, they found the sand had preserved entire archives of everyday documents, contracts, tax records, letters, written on wooden tablets. The language was an Indian one, a Prakrit, close to the speech of Gandhara, and the script was Kharoshthi, the script of the Kushan northwest. Deep in the desert, on the road to China, local clerks were still keeping their books in the administrative language of the Kushan world, generations after the empire itself had faded. Trade routes carry more than cargo. They carry the habits of the people who run them, and the habits outlast the running. Pliny's complaint, read against that storeroom and those tablets, starts to look like something more than a receipt. It looks familiar. We are often told that globalization is a modern invention, that only now have distant economies become so entangled that a decision in one capital moves prices in another. But here is that phenomenon, recorded 2,000 years ago. Roman moralists blamed silk for corrupting the young. Roman accountants watched bullion drain east. Chinese chronicles, for their part, carefully recorded the products of the far west and the value of the horse trade. Each empire was already living inside a system larger than itself, and the system had a middle, and the middle had a king. That was the true Kushan genius. And it deserves to be said plainly. They produced no silk. They grew no pepper. They mined some stones and bred some horses. But their real product was passage itself. Safety on the road. Water at the stops. A stable coinage at the exchange. A court where a foreign merchant could seek justice. Boring things. Civilizational plumbing. And in every age of connected trade, including ours, the quiet powers that provide the plumbing end up holding astonishing leverage over the loud powers that provide the goods. There was one more kind of cargo moving on those roads, and it is the reason this video exists. It paid no tolls and appeared on no manifests. Ideas travel with merchants. Always. Everywhere. And in the caravan towns of the Kushan realm, in exactly these decades, merchants and monks from northern India were beginning to carry a particular set of ideas up through the passes towards Central Asia. Ideas about suffering and compassion, and a man who had sat down under a tree 5 centuries earlier and refused to get up until he understood. The gold went west. The faith would go east. Both moved on Kushan roads. But before the faith can move in force, the empire must reach its full height. And that means gold of its own. In the next chapter, a Kushan king looks at the Roman coins piling up in his customs houses and makes a decision that will anchor the economy of India for centuries. He begins to strike gold himself. The caravans have stopped for the night. Somewhere on the high road, a fire is burning down to embers, and the bales are stacked, and the animals are still. Sleep the way the traders slept, with the journey half done and no need to hurry. Chapter 6. Vima and the Golden Coinage. Somewhere in the Kushan realm, late in the 1st century AD, a furnace is burning through the night. Into it go coins, stamped with the faces of Roman emperors. The same coins Pliny complained about, carried east in payment for silk and pepper, and now piled in the customs houses of the crossroads. Out of it comes gold of the same fine weight. But the face on it is new, a heavy-shouldered king in a tall helmet and thick felt boots, dressed for the mountains, not the Mediterranean. We should be honest that the furnace itself is an image, a way of seeing something scholars describe more cautiously. What the evidence shows is this. Rome sent enormous amounts of gold east, and at almost exactly this moment, a Kushan king began striking gold coins on a standard so close to the weight of the Roman aureus, around 8 grams, that most historians believe the two facts are connected. The simplest explanation is often the true one. The gold that left Rome did not vanish. It changed clothes. The king who made that decision was Vima Kadphises. And this chapter is about why a decision that sounds like an accounting footnote deserves to be called one of the founding acts of Indian history. First, the family matters. And here we walk carefully. The Hao Hanshu tells us that when the old founder, Kujula, died past 80, his son succeeded him and conquered Tianzhu, which is the Chinese name for northern India, installing a general there to govern it. For more than a century, historians argued about who exactly that son was, because the Chinese account and the coins seem to name different men. And the mysterious Great Saviour coins we met in the last chapter sat unexplained in the middle of the puzzle. We now know, thanks to an inscription we will stand in front of in the next chapter, that there were 2 Vimas, not one. First, Vima Taktu, the nameless great saviour of the coins, the conqueror the Chinese described. Then his son, Vima Kadphises, the man of the gold, a grandfather, a father, and a son had taken the Kushans from one tribe among 5 to a power straddling the mountains from Central Asia deep into the plains of India. Now, the gold, and why it mattered so much. Before Vima Kadphises, the money of northern India was a patchwork: old Greek silver, local copper, worn coins of vanished kingdoms, all circulating together at rates only a professional money changer could love. Watch a single transaction in a market on the Yamuna, and you can feel the problem in your fingers. A grain merchant holds a stranger's coin up to the light, turns it, frowns. He nicks the edge with a knife to see the metal under the surface. He weighs it, then weighs it again, because his scale and the stranger's memory of the last town's scale do not agree. Behind him, a queue is forming, and somewhere in that queue, a deal is quietly dying of impatience. Every transaction between strangers carried that small tax of doubt. Is this coin true? Is this metal pure? Who stands behind it? A trading empire is built on the answer to that last question. When Vima struck his gold, heavy, consistent, beautiful, and endlessly repeated, he was not decorating his treasury. He was signing a promise. Any merchant from Alexandria to the Ganges could take a Kushan gold piece in payment without knowing a word of any local language, because the coin itself was the contract, and the king was the guarantor. The knife and the frown became unnecessary. The queue moved. Multiply that saved minute by every market from the Oxus to the Ganges. Every day. For 2 centuries. And you begin to see what a currency actually is. It is trust. Minted. Historians of India note that this began a tradition of gold coinage that later Indian dynasties, above all the Guptas, would inherit and continue for centuries. The monetary spine of classical India was forged at the Kushan court, and the promise did not stop at gold. Vima reformed the copper coinage too, the heavy everyday money of bazaars and wage packets, struck to consistent standards in enormous quantities. Gold is for merchants and treasuries. Copper is for the woman buying flour and the porter collecting his pay at the end of the day. A state that standardizes both is thinking about everyone in the queue. And the sheer volume of surviving Kushan copper tells us the thinking worked. You can even hear the trade inside the words. The standard Kushan gold piece is known to scholars as a dinar, and the name is not a modern convenience. Sanskrit inscriptions and texts of the following centuries adopted the word dinara for gold money, and philologists trace that word straight back to the Latin denarius, the name of Rome's silver coin, carried east with the bullion until India took the word in, along with the gold. Say it slowly and you can hear the journey. Denarius. Dinara. Dinar. When a later Indian poet praises a gift of dinaras, there is a Roman coin buried in the sound, and a Kushan mint standing between them. The quiet middleman, even inside the language. That is the economic half of the story. The religious half is stranger and more interesting. Turn Vima's gold coin over, and on the back you do not find a Greek god or a Roman personification. You find a figure standing beside a bull, holding a trident, wearing almost nothing in the Indian manner. The god Shiva, with his bull Nandi, and around the edge, in the Kharosthi script of the Northwest, runs a royal title that scholars generally read as declaring the king a devotee of the great lord, which most take to mean Shiva himself. Let the strangeness of that register for a moment. A king descended from steppe nomads, ruling from cities built by Greeks, growing rich on Chinese and Roman trade, chose to present himself to his subjects as a servant of an Indian god, and his own father and grandfather had flirted, on their coins, with Buddhist language, and his son, as we will see, would put a whole crowd of different gods on his money. There are 2 ways to read this, and the honest path is to hold both. The skeptical reading says This is pure politics. A ruler flattering the beliefs of his newest and richest subjects, the way his grandfather had once borrowed the face of a dead Greek king. The warmer reading says that conversion and conviction were real possibilities in a world this mixed, and a king could genuinely find his God in a conquered land. The coins cannot tell us what Vima felt in his chest. They can only tell us what he wanted millions of strangers to believe about him. Either way, the message of the coin is the same, and it is the thought to carry with you into sleep. This empire does not require you to worship the king's ancestors or the king's tribal gods. The money in your hand honors what you honor. In an age when most states treated religion as a border, the Kushans were treating it as a bridge, and they were doing it deliberately. In gold, in everyone's pocket, every single day. Modern nations spend fortunes on communication and still struggle to convince diverse populations that they belong to one project. The Kushans did it with currency. Every coin was a tiny embassy. It said, in effect, you do not have to become us. You only have to trade with us and keep the roads open, and the king will guarantee the rest. There was one more message hidden in that gold, and it was aimed outward, at the other empires. A state that mints in gold on the Roman standard is announcing that it belongs at the top table, that its credit is as good as Caesar's. The nomads' grandchildren were now, in the language every treasury understood, a great power. They said so in words. 2. In the inscriptions of the dynasty, there appears a title the Kushans made their own, Devaputra, son of the gods. Historians have long noticed how neatly that title sits between the empires. In China, the ruler was the son of heaven. In Rome, the emperors styled themselves sons of the deified. The Kushans, trading with both, called their king son of the gods. And scholars debate whether the echo is deliberate borrowing, or coincidence, or simply what happens when great monarchies watch each other across the trade routes for generations. Either way, the title tells you how this dynasty now understood its place in the world. Not a tribe among tribes any longer, but one of the royal houses of the earth. Speaking of itself, in the vocabulary the other three used. Gujula Kadphises seems to have reigned into the early 2nd century AD. When he died, the empire he passed on was rich, connected, and confident, but it still spoke with borrowed voices. Greek letters on the coins, Greek titles at court, a certain lingering sense of wearing another civilization's clothes. His son would end that. His son would rename the very language of the state. Build a tower that travelers called the tallest in the world. Gather a religious council, remembered for 2,000 years, and stamp onto a small gold coin the earliest datable image of the Buddha that we can hold in a human hand. His name was Kanishka, and for 18 centuries, almost everything about him was lost. How we found him again is a story that begins with a war, a hillside, and a broken stone. The furnace has gone cold now. The new coins are stacked in the dark of the treasury, waiting for the morning markets. Let them wait. Nothing needs counting tonight. Chapter 7. Kanishka the Great. In the year 1993, in northern Afghanistan, the country was at war with itself, and in that year, at a barren hillside site called Rabatak, near the old road between Kabul and the north, local men digging in the ruins turned up a block of stone covered in carved letters that nobody present could read. It could so easily have been lost. Afghanistan in those years was full of vanishing antiquities. Instead, through a chain of lucky accidents, word of the stone reached scholars. Photographs were taken, and the inscription was eventually read by specialists in London. When the translation was published, historians of Central Asia realized they were looking at something they had wanted for 200 years and never expected to find. The Kushan Empire, which had left no chronicles, no histories, no royal archives, had finally spoken in its own voice. The Rabatak inscription is a proclamation of King Kanishka, cut in stone at the founding of a sanctuary, and nearly every line of it repays attention. It is written in the Bactrian language, the Iranian tongue of the old Greek province, but spelled out in Greek letters, one civilization's alphabet carrying another civilization's words, and in it, Kanishka does something historians can only describe as a gift across time. He names his ancestors, un by un, his great-grandfather Kujula Kadphises, his grandfather Vima Taktu, his father Vima Kadphises, in a dozen carved words. The stone settled the family puzzle that had divided scholars for generations, and gave the nameless great savior of the coins his identity back. There were two Vimas. The king himself said so. The inscription does more. Kanishka declares that he has inaugurated a new era, a year, one of his own, from which his successors would count time for generations. After long debate, many scholars now place that year 1 around 127 AD, though the dating is still discussed, and it is right to say so. He lists the great cities of the Indian plains that acknowledged his rule, and the names are astonishing in their reach, including Saketa and Kausambi and Pataliputra, the ancient imperial capital far down the Ganges. Whether every listed city was firmly governed or more loosely dominant is debated, as royal proclamations everywhere lean toward generosity, but even read cautiously. The stone describes a realm running from the deserts of Central Asia to the heart of the Ganges Valley, one of the largest states on earth in its day. The other empires had already learned to take this dynasty seriously, and we know exactly when the lesson was administered, because the Chinese wrote it down, a generation before Kanishka, around the year 90 AD. The Kushan court decided it had earned a place in the family of great powers, and asked for the hand of a Han princess. On the Chinese frontier, the request landed with Ban Chao, the formidable general who managed the western regions for the Han, and Ban Chao refused it as an impertinence. The Kushan answer, as the Ho Han Shu tells it, was an army. A viceroy named Xie led a force the chronicle numbers at 70,000 men over the Pamir Mountains, one of the highest crossings on earth. To punish the refusal, ancient troop counts deserve caution, and this one comes from the victors. But the outcome is not in doubt. Ban Chao read the situation coldly. An army that has just crossed the roof of the world arrives hungry. He emptied the countryside, gathered the grain behind walls, and waited. The Kushan force, unable to feed itself and unable to storm the fortified towns, sent riders to the oasis kingdom of Kucha for help. Ban Chao had anticipated that too, and his men ambushed the messengers on the road. The viceroy withdrew back over the mountains, and afterward, the chronicle notes with satisfaction, the Yuezhi sent tribute, one failed expedition, and yet listen to what it says underneath. The Kushans considered themselves the marriage equals of the Son of Heaven, and could throw an army over the Pamirs to insist on the point. Great powers are measured not only by their victories, but by the scale of the gambles they can afford to survive. And then there is the sentence on the Rabatak stone that tells you who Kanishka was. He announces that he has issued his edict in the Aryan language, replacing Greek. Read that again slowly. For 2 centuries, since the days of the Greek kingdom at the end of the world, the language of power in Bactria had been Greek. Kanishka, secure enough to stop borrowing, ordered the state to speak the language of its own people. On his coins, the change happens before our eyes. Early issues carry Greek titles. Then the legends shift into Bactrian, and the king takes the title Shaunano Shao, King of Kings, an old Iranian claim of supremacy. Here is where this video pays a small debt to you. In the opening tonight, we looked at a gold coin, a king in a nomad coat with flames rising from his shoulders, and on the other side, the Buddha, standing calmly. That coin is Kanishka's. The flames on the shoulders are the mark of royal glory in Iranian tradition. The word beside the standing figure, written in Greek letters, is Boddu. It is among the earliest images of the Buddha that can be securely dated anywhere in the world. And we can hold it in a human hand because a king at the crossroads decided the Buddha belonged on his money. But notice, and this is essential to who Kanishka was, the Buddha was not alone. Across the full run of Kanishka's coinage marches a crowd of divinities that no other mint in history ever assembled. Greek gods like Helios, Iranian gods like Mithra, the sun, and Nana, the great goddess, who appears on the Rabatak stone itself as the source of his kingship. Indian gods alongside them. Dozens of deities, each named, each rendered with care, each speaking to some community inside the empire. The king, with 4 civilizations for neighbors, ran a treasury with room for all of their heavens. The empire had a geography to match. The sources and the archaeology together give Kanishka not one capital but several, held in rotation with the seasons. Purushapura, modern Peshawar, as the great winter seat below the passes. Kapisa, near Begram, where those sealed storerooms of treasure were found, as the summer residence in the cool of the mountains. Mathura, on the Yamuna, as the Anchor in India, where sculptors carved portrait statues of the Kushan kings. One of those statues survives, found at the village of Mat outside Mathura, and it is among the most arresting objects in Indian archaeology. The head is gone. What remains is a broad-chested figure planted in a wide stance, gripping a sword and a mace, in the felt boots and stiff riding coat of the steppe, utterly unlike anything Indian sculpture had made before. Down the front of the coat runs an inscription, and it wastes no words. The great king, king of kings, son of God, Kanishka, even headless. The statue still does the job it was built to do 2,000 years ago. It informs you, without argument, who is in charge. A court that migrated like the old herds, from plain to mountain and back. An empire ruled from the saddle, even at the height of its wealth. And above Purushapura rose Kanishka's most famous act of construction. Chinese Buddhist pilgrims who travelled this road centuries later, men like Xuanzang in the 600s AD, described a stupa raised by Kanishka outside the city, a relic tower of wood and stone, so tall that their accounts strain belief. Measured by some at more than 400 cubits, travellers spoke of it as one of the tallest buildings anywhere in the ancient world. In the early 1900s, excavators at a mound called Shahji Ki Deri outside Peshawar uncovered what most identify as its foundations. And within, a small bronze casket bearing the king's name, holding relics venerated as the Buddha's own. Peshawar held the relics, but the dynasty also built for its own gods. And the proof stands on a hilltop in northern Afghanistan called Surkh Kotal, excavated by French archaeologists beginning in 1952. The site is a great terrace sanctuary, climbing the hill in flights of monumental stairs, crowned by a temple that sheltered not a Buddha, but, most scholars conclude, the dynasty itself, a shrine of sacred fire and royal images in the old Iranian manner. The long Bactrian inscription found there, the same one that would later help scholars crack the language, records the sanctuary and its restoration and ties it to Kanishka's line. hold the two buildings side by side. The relic tower at Peshawar and the fire sanctuary at Surkh Kotal. And you can see the whole Kushan religious settlement written in architecture. Buddhism, embraced with one hand. The gods of the dynasty, honored with the other. And no contradiction anywhere. Because in this empire, the heavens were as plural as the markets. Think about what stands behind that pairing. Because it holds the deepest truth this empire has to offer. Most empires, at their peak, build monuments to their own victories. Kanishka's empire, at its peak, built its greatest monument to a foreign sage who taught the renunciation of power. That choice was not weakness, and it was not accident. It was the crossroads empire understanding its own nature. Rome at its height exported law. China, at its height, exported order. The Kushans, at their height, exported passage. For goods. For gold. And now, decisively, for a faith. The Connector Empire had found the cargo that would outlast every caravan. Buddhist tradition remembers Kanishka as its second great royal patron, a new Ashoka, and remembers a great council of monks gathered under his protection to settle the teachings. What that council was, what it decided, and how much of the memory is history rather than devotion, is a careful story of its own, and it is where we go next. For tonight, leave the king where the stone at Rabatak leaves him, secure in his era, naming his fathers, speaking at last in his own language. The hillside kept his words safe through 18 centuries of wind and war. They can keep until morning too. Rest now. Chapter 8. The Council and the Turn North. How does a religion travel? Not the easy version of that question. The one about ships and roads. The harder one. How does a teaching born in one language, one landscape, one web of local memory, become something a stranger 3,000 miles away can receive, understand, and build a life on? Every faith that has ever crossed a border has had to solve that problem. This chapter is about how Buddhism solved it. Inside the Kushan Empire, in the 2nd century AD, and it begins with an honest admission about the sources. Because the most famous event of this chapter may not have happened the way tradition remembers it. And you deserve to know that up front. The tradition goes like this. The great king Kanishka, troubled by the fact that the Buddhist schools of his day disagreed with one another, gathered 500 learned monks, by most accounts in Kashmir, under the presidency of a master named Vasumitra, with the great writer Ashvaghosha assisting. There, the assembly reviewed the teachings and set down authoritative commentaries, a vast scholarly compendium associated with the school called the Sarvastivada. Buddhist memory counts this gathering as the 4th Great Council, placing Kanishka in a direct line with Ashoka, the model of the righteous Buddhist king. Now the honesty. That account comes to us from Buddhist sources written down centuries later, most famously from the Chinese pilgrim, Xuanzang, who walked these roads 500 years after Kanishka and recorded what the monasteries told him. No inscription of Kanishka mentions the council, the Rabatak stone, where the king speaks in his own voice, credits his kingship to the goddess Nana, and honors a whole assembly of Iranian divinities. Some modern scholars, therefore, read the council as a memory shaped by devotion, a tradition that grew in the telling. Others point out that traditions this specific usually crystallize around something real, a royal patronage, a scholarly project, a gathering of some kind under Kushan protection. So we will say it the careful way. According to Buddhist tradition, Kanishka convened a great council. What history can confirm is something quieter and, in the long run, far more powerful. Under the Kushans, Buddhism changed shape, and the changes are exactly the ones a faith needs before it can travel. Here is the first change, and it is made of birch bark. In the 1990s, a collection of scrolls surfaced from the region of ancient Gandhara and entered the British Library. Brittle rolls of bark covered in the Kharosthi script, in the local language called Gandhari. When specialists dated and read them, they turned out to be Buddhist texts from roughly the first centuries of our era, the oldest Buddhist manuscripts ever found, and among the oldest surviving manuscripts of any Indian religion. Think about what they represent. For 4 or 5 centuries, the Buddha's teaching had lived the way many ancient oral teachings lived, in trained human memory, chanted, corrected, passed mouth to mouth. Now, in the Kushan heartland, in the Kushan era, it was being written down. A memorized teaching can die with a generation of monks. A written one can be packed in a saddlebag. Try to see the moment of change itself. Because a revolution can be very quiet. In a monastery courtyard in Gandhara, an old monk recites, and has recited all his life, the way his teachers recited before him. Thousands of lines held in the body like music. Across from him sits a younger man with a reed pen, a pot of ink, and a rolled strip of birch bark, writing down what he hears. Neither of them thinks of this as a turning point in world history. The old man perhaps trusts the page less than his own trained memory. And he is not wrong to. Since pages rot and a page cannot correct a student's pronunciation, but the page can go where he cannot. The page does not need to eat on the road to China, somewhere in a courtyard like that one, without any ceremony at all. The teaching stopped being a performance and became a cargo, and tradition attaches one more name to Kanishka's circle that deserves a moment of its own. Ashvaghosha, the master remembered as an assistant at the council. He was also remembered as one of the great poets of the age, and a work that has come down under his name, the Buddha Charita, the Acts of the Buddha, is the earliest complete poetic life of the Buddha that survives. Think of what that represents. The teacher's story, retold as high literature, in polished, courtly Sanskrit. Art placed deliberately in the service of the message. The dating and the attribution are debated, as everything in this period is. But the pairing of a scholar-poet with a patron king fits everything else we can see. A faith preparing to travel needs its texts in order, its story told beautifully, and its images ready. Under the Kushans, all three were happening at once. The second change is the one that reshaped half of Asia. In these same centuries, in these same territories, a new movement within Buddhism was gathering strength. The movement that called itself the Mahayana, the Great Vehicle. This is a sleep video, not a seminary, so hold just one idea about it. The older ideal, centered on the Arhat, the practitioner who perfects himself and steps off the wheel of suffering. The Mahayana raised up a different hero, the Bodhisattva, a being who stands at the very threshold of liberation and turns back, vowing to remain in the world until every other being can be carried across too. Compassion, in this vision, is not an ornament of the path. It is the path. Scholars debate how and where the Mahayana began, and no serious historian claims the Kushans invented it. But there is broad agreement on this. The movement flourished spectacularly in the Kushan world, and it travelled north in Kushan saddlebags. And it is worth pausing to ask why that particular teaching suited that particular empire so well. A faith centered on a universal savior figure, open to lay people and merchants, and not only to monks, expressed in texts rather than in one sacred landscape, is a faith with no homesickness. It does not need the Ganges. It can live in a caravan town. It can live anywhere, and the caravan towns were ready for it. Follow the money one more time, the way we did in Chapter 5. Buddhist monasteries in the Kushan era grew up along the trade arteries, like beads on those same strings. At Taxila, up the Kabul Valley, through the high passes, out along the oases of the Tarim Basin. Merchants funded monasteries as acts of merit, and monasteries in turn served the roads. Fixed points of shelter, trust, and literacy in hard country. Monks moved with the caravans, because that is where safety was. The Silk Road did not merely permit the spread of Buddhism. The two grew into each other. Root and trellis. You can still walk the physical remains of that partnership at Taxila, in what is now northern Pakistan. Excavations, led by John Marshall in the early 1900s, uncovered the great Dharmarajika stupa and the monasteries clustered around it. Courts of monks' cells arranged around quiet courtyards, assembly halls, bathing places, and everywhere the small votive stupas donated by the faithful. The donor inscriptions are the telling part. Merchants, householders, officials, women of the city, a cross-section of a trading town, buying merit in stone at the junction where the roads from India met the roads over the mountains. Faith and commerce were not rivals here. They kept each other's accounts. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, the results begin to appear in the Chinese records themselves. And here, the ground under our feet becomes firm again. Chinese sources record translators from the western regions arriving in the Han capital of Luoyang, rendering Buddhist texts into Chinese for the first time. Among the earliest and greatest of them was a man remembered in Chinese as Zhi Lujiachen, known to scholars as Lokak Shema, active in the late 100s AD, and the first syllable of his Chinese name, Zhi, was the badge the Chinese attached to people of his origin. It meant the Yuezhi, the people of the Skull Cup, the people of the long flight west, were now carrying scriptures east. Back along the very road their ancestors had fled down 3 centuries before. Hold that circle in your mind as you drift, because the whole night lives inside it. History rhymes in strange ways. A defeat on the edge of the Gobi in the 2nd century BC set a people running west. The running gave them the crossroads. The crossroads gave them the wealth. The wealth sheltered a faith while it learned to write. And the faith, once written, flowed back east along the road of the exile, into China, and in time to Korea and Japan. No Xiongnu victory, no Kushan Empire, and without the Kushan Empire, one of the great religious transmissions in world history loses its most important early bridge. The monks who made that crossing will get their own chapter soon, because they deserve it. But before the faith could truly conquer the East, it needed one more thing, something no text could provide. It needed a face. For 400 years, the Buddha had almost never been shown as a man. And then, in the Kushan workshops of Gandhara and Mathura, in the space of a generation or two, he received the face. The whole world now knows. How that happened is the next chapter. The scrolls are rolled and resting in their jars. The lamps in the monastery are out. All but one. Let that one burn. Someone is always copying. Sleep. Chapter 9. The first face of the Buddha. There is a carving from the early days of Buddhist art, from the great stone gateways of central India, that shows a royal procession coming out to honor the Buddha. The horses are carved with love. The trees, the crowds, the parasols. Every detail is there, except the Buddha, where he should stand. The sculptors carved an empty space beneath a tree. In other scenes, his presence is shown as a pair of footprints, a riderless horse, an empty throne, a wheel, for roughly 4 centuries after his death, across the whole Buddhist world. Artists depicted the teacher's life without depicting the teacher. Scholars still discuss the reasons, whether it was formal doctrine or deep reverence, or simply an artistic convention so strong nobody thought to break it. What no one disputes is the fact. Early Buddhist art is full of the Buddha's absence. And then, in the Kushan Empire, the absence ends. This chapter is about one of the quietest revolutions in the history of human culture. The making of the Buddha image. It happened in Kushan workshops, in the Kushan centuries, in 2 great centers at once, and the 2 centers made 2 very different faces. The first center was Gandhara, the old northwest, the country around Purushapura and Taxila, where the Kushan winter capital stood. We have walked this ground all night. It was the land where Greek kings had ruled, where Greek remained the language of coins within living memory, where the caravans brought Roman bronzes and Alexandrian glass up from the ports, when the sculptors of Gandhara began to carve the Buddha as a man. They reached for the visual language they had inherited, and that language was Greek. Look at a Gandharan Buddha, and you are looking at 2 worlds in one block of schist. The top knot of the Indian sage becomes waving Mediterranean hair. The monastic robe falls in deep, naturalistic folds, carved exactly like the drapery on a Greek philosopher's statue. Museum labels sometimes put it plainly: a Buddha with the body language of Apollo. Art historians have debated for more than a century how direct the classical influence was, whether it came overland from the old Bactrian Greek tradition or by sea with the Roman trade. And that debate continues. But the family resemblance is not in dispute. In Gandhara, the Buddha received a face that a traveller from the Mediterranean would have found strangely familiar. The second centre was Mathura, far to the southeast, the Kushan anchor city on the Yamuna River in the Indian heartland. Mathura's sculptors worked in a different stone, a warm red sandstone flecked with cream, and they worked from a different inheritance. Their models were the yakshas, the broad-shouldered, big-chested nature spirits of old Indian art, figures of abundance and power. The Mathura Buddha is not a contemplative Apollo. He is massive, open-eyed, radiantly confident, his robe clinging thin as water so the strong body shows through, one hand raised in reassurance. If the Gandharan Buddha seems to be thinking, the Mathura Buddha seems to be blessing. For generations, scholars argued fiercely about which city made the first Buddha image, and national pride was never far from the argument. A European classical origin against an Indian one. The honest state of the question today is that both workshops were active early in the Kushan period, quite possibly within the same decades, and the priority may never be settled. For our purposes tonight, the argument itself is the point. The 2 faces were born of the same empire, the same roads, the same royal peace, and travellers and pilgrims carried both styles up and down the Kushan highways, where they met, borrowed from each other, and slowly blended. We even have a royal timestamp, the gold coin from our opening. Kanishka's coin with the standing figure and the word Boddo beside it in Greek letters is among the earliest images of the Buddha that can be dated to a specific reign, around 127 AD or in the years that followed. The image was official enough, recognized enough, to represent the faith on the money of the King of Kings. Whatever happened first in the workshops, by Kanishka's day, the Buddha had a face the whole empire could recognize, and one small object may push the story earlier still, and it connects 2 ends of this night in a way no writer would dare invent. In the 1830s, at a ruined stupa called Bimaran, near Jalalabad, in eastern Afghanistan, A wandering Englishman named Charles Masson, a man we will meet properly in our final chapter, dug out a small golden casket set with garnets. Around its sides, worked in gold, stands the Buddha in a Greek-style arched niche, flanked by the gods Brahma and Indra in attitudes of reverence. It is one of the most beautiful small objects to survive from the ancient world, and one of the most argued about, because, if the earlier datings that some scholars defend are correct, the Begram casket may carry one of the very first images of the Buddha ever made. The dating remains genuinely open, and we will not pretend otherwise. But hold the object in your mind. A golden box, small enough to cup in 2 hands, on which a new way of imagining the sacred may have made one of its first appearances in the history of the world. Learn the grammar of the image while it is still new, because every element was a decision. The gentle swelling on the crown of the head, called the Ushnisha, marking wisdom beyond the ordinary. The small dot between the brows, the urna, the earlobes, long and empty, stretched by the weight of the princely earrings the young Siddhartha once wore and then renounced, so that the ears themselves tell the story of a man who gave up a kingdom, the monastic robe, the half-closed eyes, the hand-raised palm outward in the gesture that says, "Do not be afraid." None of it is accidental. The Kushan-era workshops were not just carving a portrait. They were building a vocabulary, sign by sign, that any pilgrim could read without a single written word. Step into one of those workshops before we leave it. On an ordinary working morning in Gandhara, the floor is grey with schist dust, and the light comes in low through the doorway, catching the dust in a slanted bar. Half-finished figures line the wall. A torso, here. A head there, with the curls blocked out, but the face still sleeping inside the stone. An older carver moves down the row, correcting with a fingertip. A touch on a fold of drapery. A touch beside an eye. Most of these men are anonymous forever. Not one signature survives on the great Buddhas of Gandhara. They were paid by monasteries and merchants. They worked to order, and they had no way of knowing that they were setting the face of the sacred for half of mankind. Revolutions do not always know their own names. Now step back, because what follows may change what you see the next time you pass a Buddha statue in a museum, a garden, or a temple. Nearly every major tradition of Buddha imagery, from Afghanistan to Kyoto, traces some line of descent back to this Kushan-era transformation. The serene half-closed eyes, the top knot, the long earlobes, the folded robe, the raised hand, the colossal bronzes of Japan, the gilded figures of Thailand, the cave Buddhas of China, the statue on a shelf in a yoga studio in Ohio. Centuries after the Kushans, sculptors would carve 2 colossal Buddhas into a cliff face at Bamiyan. On the old road through the Afghan mountains, figures so large that travelers wrote home about them for 1,000 years. Direct descendants of the Gandharan workshops, and they stood in their niches until the year 2001. The details differ from land to land, and local genius reshaped the image in every country it entered. But the underlying grammar of the image, the very idea that this teacher is shown this way, was worked out in the Kushan workshops of Gandhara and Mathura, a face invented at the crossroads by Indian sculptors and Greek-trained carvers. Under step descended kings, paid for with trade gold from Rome and China. It may be among the most widely reproduced human images in history, and it has no single author and no single homeland. It is what 4 civilizations look like when they agree on something. And notice what the image did for the faith, because this connects to everything we have followed tonight. Texts. As we saw in the last chapter, let a teaching travel without its homeland. Images let it travel without its language. A merchant's wife in a Tarim oasis, who could not read a single line of Gandhara, could stand before the carved figure and understand calm, compassion, invitation. The Mahayana, with its universal savior, turned toward all beings, had found its perfect vehicle. When Buddhism finally crossed into China in strength, it did not arrive as an argument. It arrived as a face. The empire that built no Colosseum had produced something quieter and more durable than any arena. Stone by stone, coin by coin, it was assembling the visual language of half the world's devotion. The workshops are closed now. Red sandstone dust settles at Mathura. Grey schist dust settles at Taxila. Somewhere between them, on a night road, a cart is carrying a finished statue north toward the passes. Packed in straw, face up under the stars. Let it travel. You can rest. Chapter 10. The Monks Who Walked East. Chinese tradition tells a story about a dream. One night, in the 60s AD, the story goes, the Han Emperor Ming dreamed of a golden man flying before his palace, light streaming from his body. In the morning, his ministers told him of a sage of the West called the Buddha, and the emperor sent envoys along the trade roads to find this teaching. They returned, tradition says, with scriptures and images carried on a white horse. And at Luoyang, a temple was founded called the White Horse Monastery, remembered ever after as the first Buddhist monastery in China. Let us be honest with each other, the way we have been all night. That story was written down long after the events it describes, and historians treat it as a founding legend rather than a documented embassy. The dream is tradition, not record, but strip the legend away, and what actually stands behind it is better documented, and stranger, and more human. Buddhism really did arrive in China in these very decades, and it did not arrive on a magic horse. It arrived on foot, in the company of specific men whose names we still know, and an astonishing number of them came from the empire we have been following all night. The Chinese sources let us watch it happen. By the middle of the 2nd century AD, foreign teachers were at work in Luoyang, the Han capital, doing something no one had ever done before, turning Buddhist texts into Chinese. One of the first great names is An Shigao, whose Chinese surname An marked him as a man of Anxi, the Parthian realm. Tradition remembers him as a Parthian prince who renounced a throne for the religious life. And while that detail cannot be verified, the shape of his work can be. The catalogues credit him with dozens of translations, the first serious body of Buddhist literature in the Chinese language. And close behind him came the man we met 2 chapters ago, Lokakshima, active in Luoyang in the late 100s AD, whose Chinese surname Zhi marked him as a man of the Yuezhi, the Kushan world. Read down the lists of early translators preserved in Chinese Buddhist catalogues, and the same surnames repeat. An for Parthians, Zi for Yuezhi, Kang for Sogdians. The catalogues are, in effect, a passenger manifest for the Silk Road, and the Kushan realm supplied a striking share of the passengers. Linger on Lokakshima for a moment, because his work answers the question this whole night has been building toward. It was Lokakshima, the man of the Yuezhi, who first rendered the new Mahayana scriptures into Chinese. The texts of the great vehicle we met in Chapter 8, the teaching of the Bodhisattva who turns back for all beings, the version of Buddhism that would one day shape China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam entered the Chinese language through the hands of a translator from the Kushan sphere. The bridge was not a metaphor. The bridge had a name and a surname, and the surname meant Yuezhi. Now consider what these men were actually attempting, because it may be the hardest intellectual labor in this entire story. Harder than any conquest we have described. Chinese and Sanskrit are about as unrelated as two languages can be. Worse, the concepts had no Chinese homes. How do you say nirvana to a civilization that has never imagined it? How do you say enlightenment, emptiness, rebirth? The early translators reached for the nearest Chinese ideas. Many of them borrowed from Taoist vocabulary, and scholars of Chinese Buddhism describe how generations of teachers matched foreign concepts to native ones. A method, the tradition itself, later named and criticized. The first Chinese Buddhism was, unavoidably, Buddhism wearing Chinese clothes. It took centuries of retranslation to tailor the fit. But that is how every great crossing actually works. Not one clean leap, but a long negotiation, conducted by bilingual men at writing tables, one impossible word at a time. The Chinese sources even let us see how the work was organized. And it was not one man alone at a desk. Translation in these bureaus was performed out loud, as a kind of ensemble. The foreign master recited the text from memory or read it aloud, and explained its meaning. An interpreter turned the explanation into spoken Chinese. Scribes wrote down what they heard, and checkers read it back, and the room argued its way, phrase by phrase, towards something everyone could accept. A single scripture might pass through 6 or 8 pairs of hands between the reciting voice and the finished page. Keep that picture beside everything else tonight has shown you. The gateway of Buddhism into China was not a door. It was a room full of people talking. The negotiation outlived them all, and the road kept supplying negotiators. 2 centuries after Lokakshema, a boy was born in the oasis kingdom of Kucha, on the northern rim of the Tarim Basin. To a family, the sources connect with both India and the local royal house. His name was Kumar Rajiva, and he would become the most celebrated translator in the history of Chinese Buddhism. Captured in war, held for years by a frontier warlord, he arrived at the Chinese capital of Chang'an in the year 401 AD, and there, at the head of a translation bureau said to number hundreds of assistants, he retranslated the great Mahayana texts, including some that Lokakshema had first attempted 200 years before. The versions Kumarajiva produced were so clear and so beautiful that many are still the standard versions chanted in East Asian temples today. Hold that continuity for a moment. A text carried out of the Kushan world in the 100s, first translated by a man of Yuezhi descent, perfected by a man of the Oasis Roads 2 centuries later, and recited this evening, somewhere in Tokyo or Seoul, in words Kumarajiva chose. And the faith kept moving, because the logic of the roads did not stop at Luoyang. At Dunhuang, the last Chinese oasis before the desert crossings, monks began cutting cave shrines into a cliff face in the year 366 AD, by the traditional account, and kept cutting and painting them for 1,000 years, until the cliffs held hundreds of chapels and tens of thousands of painted Buddhas, the largest gallery of Buddhist art on earth, parked exactly where the caravan road bottlenecked. Faith, like water, pools at the narrow places of the world. Chinese records state that, in the year 372 AD, a monk arrived at the northern Korean kingdom of Goguryeo bearing scriptures and images, sent with official blessing. From Korea the teaching crossed the sea, the Nihon Shoki, the ancient chronicle of Japan, records the moment in the 500s AD when the king of the Korean kingdom of Baekje sent the Japanese court a gift, Buddhist scriptures and a gilt bronze image of the Buddha, with a message praising this most excellent teaching. Japanese tradition places that moment in 552 AD. Other sources suggest 500 38 AD. And historians still weigh the two dates. Either way, notice what physically arrived in Japan: a text and an image. The two vehicles this empire perfected: the written word from chapter 8 and the face from chapter 9, delivered together in a single diplomatic package. 1,000 years of consequences in one wooden crate. By then the road had begun to pull in the other direction too. In the year 399 AD, an elderly Chinese monk named Faxian walked out of Chang'an heading west, determined to reach India itself and bring back complete copies of the monastic rules. His route led him straight through the old Kushan heartlands, over the high passes and down the gorges into Gandhara and Peshawar, where he saw Kanishka's great stupa still standing and wrote down the traditions the monks told about it. He came home by sea years later, an old man with a bag of books, and left an account of his journey that survives complete to this day. Read it, and you can feel the current of the road reversed. For 3 centuries the teaching had flowed east toward China. Now China was walking west to drink from the source. Underneath all these dates and names, one truth deserves to be said plainly, and it reaches far beyond the ancient world. We speak of civilizations exchanging ideas as if cultures were clouds that drift into each other. They are not. Every idea that has ever crossed a border crossed it inside a person. Someone learned 2 languages. Someone left home knowing they would probably never return. Someone spent 30 years in a foreign capital arguing over how to translate a single word, and died there, and was buried far from their ancestors. The transmission of Buddhism from India through the Kushan lands to East Asia is sometimes called one of the greatest cultural transfers in human history, and it was accomplished by a few hundred named individuals with sore feet and ink-stained fingers. The Kushan Empire's contribution was to make their journeys survivable, fundable, and worth attempting. Empires cannot believe anything, but they can hold a door open, and this one did, for 3 centuries, at exactly the moment it mattered. There is one more irony to put in your pocket before sleep. The Han emperors had once sent Jiang Qian west to find the Yuezhi and bring back an army. The Yuezhi never sent the army. Instead, 300 years late, they sent monks, and the monks conquered more of China than any army ever has. The writing table in Luoyang is tidy now. Brushes washed. The difficult scroll weighted flat for morning. One word remains untranslated. It can wait for you to dream a while. Chapter 11. The Quiet Ebb. In the Iranian heartland, at the ancient royal site of Naqsh-e-Rustam, there stands a square stone tower called the Kaaba-i-Zartosht, and carved into its walls is an inscription in 3 languages. In it, a ruler lists the lands he claims. The list runs east, province after province, and then it reaches a name that concerns us: Kushansha, the land of the Kushans, claimed as far as the limits of the known east. The ruler was Shapur I, king of kings of the new Sasanian dynasty of Persia, and the inscription dates to the 260s AD. Historians debate how much of that vast eastern claim was firm possession and how much was a king's arithmetic of glory. But the stone tells us one thing beyond argument. Little more than a century after Kanishka counted his cities on the stone at Rabatak, a foreign king was counting Kushan lands on a stone of his own. This chapter is about how that happened, and the first thing to say is what did not happen. There was no Kushan equivalent of the fall of Rome, no burning capital that echoed through world literature, no last emperor whose name every schoolchild learns. The Kushan Empire did not fall. It ebbed, the way a tide ebbs, so gradually that we cannot name the day the water was gone. For a history channel, that is an awkward shape for a story. It is also, as we will see, the most honest lesson this empire has to teach. Follow the ebb from its high water mark. After Kanishka came his successors, and the coins and inscriptions let you trace them. Huvishka reigned long and richly through the middle 100s AD. His mint still crowded with that parliament of gods from chapter 7. On Huvishka's gold, the king lounges on cushions, rides an elephant, wears jeweled caps, a portrait gallery of comfort, the money of an empire that no longer feels it has anything to prove. Then, around the turn of the 200s AD, came a king whose name deserves a pause, Vasudeva. Hear what that name is. Vasudeva is a thoroughly Indian name, tied in Indian tradition to the god Krishna, the dynasty that began with Kujula, a steppe chieftain with a Greek face on his coins, now crowned a king named for an Indian god. And on Vasudeva's coins, the crowd of divinities thins until Shiva, with his bull, stands almost alone. Scholars read in this a dynasty settling ever deeper into India, becoming, generation by generation, a piece of the land it had once descended into through the passes. Remember this, because it shapes the ending. The Kushans did not vanish from history. To a real degree, they dissolved into it. While the dynasty grew more Indian, the world around it turned hostile in a way it had never planned for. Go back to the map from chapter 5. The four empires in a line. Rome, Parthia, the Kushans, Han, China, and the Kushans, rich in the middle. Now watch the map break. In 220 AD, the Han dynasty, plagued by rebellion and warlords, formally ended, and China split into three warring kingdoms. The eastern anchor of the world system was gone. 4 years later, in 224 AD, a Persian lord named Ardashir overthrew the last Parthian king and founded the Sasanian dynasty, a state far more centralized, far more aggressive, and far more interested in the east than Parthia had ever been. The western neighbor was no longer a fellow toll collector. It was a rival with an army, and the far western anchor was failing at the same time. In the middle 200s AD, the Roman Empire tumbled into what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Decades of civil war, plague, and collapsing currency. Emperors murdered in quick succession. The silver coinage debased until merchants weighed it with open suspicion. The details belong to another night. But one consequence belongs to this one. The flood of Roman gold that had fed the crossroads for 2 centuries thinned. A middleman empire can survive a bad neighbor. It cannot easily survive a bad century at both ends of the road at once. The blow fell within a generation. Sasanian forces pushed into Bactria, and by the middle 200s AD, the old Kushan heartland, north of the Hindu Kush, was under Persian control, governed by princes who took a title that says everything. Kushansha, king of the Kushans. Historians call this hybrid regime the Kushano-Sasanians. Study its coins, and you find something almost poignant. Persian governors striking money in the Kushan style, with Bactrian legends, honoring local gods. The conquerors had to dress as Kushans to rule Kushan land, which tells you the empire's forms had sunk deeper than its armies could defend. Stand for a moment in one of the caravan towns from chapter 5, a generation into the ebb, and feel the difference in your skin. The camel bells still come down from the north, but fewer, and later in the season, in the courtyard of the caravanserai, there are empty stalls now, and the dust settles longer between arrivals. The money changer still sits behind his scale, but some mornings the scale barely moves, and the coins crossing it are lighter than his father's coins. The gold paler, the king's face on them, a stranger's, Nobody in the town could tell you the empire is ending. There is no smoke on the horizon. No army at the gate. There is only a little less of everything, year after year, the way a river drops in a dry decade, until one summer the boats simply do not come. South of the mountains, a reduced Kushan kingdom held on in the Punjab and around Mathura for another century. But the sources thin, the coins shrink and coarsen, and the names of the last kings are known mainly to specialists. In India, a new power was rising from the Ganges, the Gupta dynasty, and a Gupta inscription of the 300s AD lists among the distant rulers who paid the emperor homage, a line of kings that scholars identify with the Kushan remnant. And it names them by their old proud titles: sons of the gods, kings of kings, the vocabulary of Kanishka now recited in another dynasty's victory monument. The tollmasters of Asia had become someone else's footnote. Later still, new peoples came down from the steppe in the old way. First the Kidarites, who claimed the Kushan name as a borrowed crown. Then the Hephthalites, whom neighbouring writers called the White Huns. By the 400s AD, the Kushan state was gone in every meaningful sense, and there is no battle, no treaty, no date to memorize for its ending. Two small survivals show how deep the roots had gone. The first is time itself, Kanishka's era. The year 1 he proclaimed at Rabatak went on being used to date documents and dedications for generations after the throne behind it had crumbled. And some scholars argue that later Indian calendar traditions preserve its memory in altered form. Kings fall quickly. Calendars are stubborn. The second survival is the Great Stupa at Peshawar. Chinese pilgrims, who came through in the 500s and 600s AD, men like Songyun and Xuanzang, reported that the tower had burned and been rebuilt more than once, and that it still stood, still drew pilgrims from across Asia, still anchored the skyline of a city whose Kushan masters were 3 centuries gone. Buildings can outlive their builders by a very long time, when what they hold still matters to the living. So why did it die quietly? The answer reaches past the ancient world, and it is worth carrying into our own century. The Kushan Empire's power was never really its army or its culture. As we said at the very start of tonight, its power was its position. It stood in the middle and sold passage. And that is a magnificent business, exactly as long as the giants on either side of you stay stable and stay apart. The moment one collapses and another turns predatory, the middleman's position becomes a corridor for other people's ambitions. Connector powers rarely get a heroic last stand, because their strength was never the kind you can spend on a battlefield. When the world system that made them necessary broke, they did not so much fall as become unnecessary. It is worth looking around our own time and asking which prosperous crossroads states live by that same silent clause. And yet, hold the ending against the cargo, because this is the consolation the story offers. The empire ebbed. The transmission did not. The monks kept walking east through the passes long after the passes changed owners. The translators in Chinese capitals kept working through the fall of Han and the chaos that followed. The Buddha image kept spreading through the Tarim oases while Kushanshahs and Kidarites traded the ruins above them. The carrier died. The cargo compounded. Whatever the Kushans had been building without knowing it outlived every institution they built on purpose. There is a fair question to ask of a story like this one. If the empire mattered so much, why have most of us never heard of it? Why did the world forget the hinge it turned on? That question has an answer, and the answer involves lost languages. A deserter from a colonial army wandering Afghanistan with his pockets full of coins, and a broken stone on a hillside at war. It is the last chapter of our journey. The tide is far out now. The shore is smooth and dark. Nothing more is asked of anyone tonight. Chapter 12. The Empire History Forgot. In the 1830s, a strange Englishman was walking across Afghanistan. His name, or at least the name he used, was Charles Masson. He presented himself as an American traveller. He was in fact a deserter from the army of the East India Company, a man with every reason to keep moving, and he had fallen completely in love with ruins. For years, Masson wandered the plains north of Kabul, and at a site near Begram, the very ground where those sealed rooms of treasure would be found a century later. He gathered ancient coins from farmers and dealers by the tens of thousands. It was Masson, too, who opened the ruined stupa at Bimaran and lifted out the golden casket we met in Chapter 9, with what may be one of the earliest Buddha images ever made. His finds travelled to London, where much of the collection rests in the British Museum to this day. Among the coins, again and again, came gold and copper pieces bearing kings nobody could name, in a script nobody could read, showing gods nobody could identify. Masson and the scholars of his generation were holding the Kushan Empire in their hands, and they did not know it, because the empire had suffered the strangest fate available to a great power. It had been deleted. Masson himself deserves a footnote of honesty first, since honesty has been our habit all night. His real name was James Lewis. He had walked away from a Bengal artillery regiment in 1827, invented an American identity, and lived for years, one rumor ahead of arrest, until the authorities discovered who he was and offered a deserter's bargain, a pardon in exchange for work gathering intelligence. He took the bargain, kept digging, and eventually returned to London, where the man who had recovered more of the Kushan Empire than anyone alive died in obscurity. His notebooks scattered into archives. History. It turns out, he was rescued by exactly the kind of person history usually forgets. Hold on to that. It will not be the last time tonight. Think back across everything we have followed tonight and ask the bookkeeping question. Rome kept its historians. So Rome is remembered. Han China kept its dynastic histories. So its story runs unbroken. India remembered its epics and its Dharma texts. But the Kushans wrote no chronicle that survives. Their administrative archives, if they existed on perishable materials, rotted in a climate of hard winters and snowmelt. The Buddhist tradition remembered Kanishka warmly but hazily, as a pious patron in legends, and the empire's own language, Bactrian, that Iranian tongue in Greek letters that Kanishka proudly made official on the stone at Rabatak, fell out of use in the centuries after the Hephthalites, until no living person on earth could read it. An empire that connected 4 literate civilizations ended up with its memory outsourced to all 4, and each kept only the fragments that mattered to itself. To China, it was a supplier of monks and horses. To Rome, an address on the Silk Route. To India, one dynasty among many. To Persia, a trophy on a cliff. The whole was nowhere. Why did they never write their own book? We can only reason about it. Carefully. The dynasty came from an oral world, where memory was a trained skill, and the past lived in recitation. The empire wrote constantly, but much of it on perishable materials. In a climate that eats them, what survived is what was cut into stone or struck into metal. Proclamations and money. The formats of authority rather than of storytelling. Rome wrote for posterity, because Romans believed posterity was watching. The Kushans, perhaps, were simply too busy running the roads to audition for it. The recovery of the whole is one of the quiet detective stories of modern scholarship, and it took 2 centuries. It began with coins, Mason's coins, and thousands more, which let numismatists build the first list of kings from nothing but portraits and titles. The Chinese histories were reread, and the Guishuang of the Hou Hanshu was matched to the Kushana of Indian inscriptions and the coin's own legends. In 1957, French excavators at the hilltop temple of Surkh Kotal, the fire sanctuary we visited in Chapter 7, uncovered the long inscription in the mystery script, and the Bactrian language began, letter by letter, to give up its grammar. Then, in the 1990s, bundles of ancient documents began surfacing from northern Afghanistan, letters and contracts on leather and cloth, written in Bactrian, spanning centuries of ordinary life in the region, marriage agreements, land sales, complaints about taxes, scholars. Above all, the London specialist Nicholas Sims Williams spent years reading them, and suddenly the language of the Kushan world could be heard doing everyday work, not proclaiming from a hillside, but haggling, promising, apologizing. And in 1993, in the middle of a civil war, came the broken stone from Rabatak, where Kanishka names his fathers and his gods and his cities in his own official voice, piece by piece, over 200 years. The deleted file was reconstructed from everyone else's backups, and then, at last, from its own, and the recovery has its own heroes, because the wars that shook Afghanistan reached the museums too. In the 1990s, the National Museum in Kabul was shelled and looted, and in 2001, the colossal Buddhas of Bamiyan were dynamited. The Begram treasures, the Roman glass and Chinese lacquer and Indian ivories from those sealed rooms, were widely assumed to be lost with everything else. They were not. A small circle of museum staff had quietly crated the finest pieces years earlier and hidden them in vaults beneath the presidential compound, and then kept the secret for a quarter of a century, through every regime and every threat, telling no one, until conditions finally allowed the crates to be opened in 2004, intact. Afghanistan remembers these men as the key holders. Ask what the Kushan Empire can still summon from people 20 centuries after its fall, and there is your answer. Within living memory, ordinary museum workers risked their lives, for decades, to keep its evidence safe. So the empire was forgotten, for reasons we can actually specify. But being forgotten is not the same as being unimportant. And the Kushans may be the cleanest proof of that in all of world history. Measure importance not by fame, but by consequence, by what would be missing if you removed them. And then run the experiment in your mind. Remove the Kushans. The Yuezhi remain scattered chiefdoms, and no single power holds both ends of the Hindu Kush, passes at the moment Rome. Parthia and Han China light up the trade routes. No Kushan peace shelters Gandhara, while the Buddha's teaching is written onto birch bark, and while his face is worked out in schist and sandstone. No Kushan roads carry the Mahayana north to the Tarim oasis, and the translators surnamed Ji never reach Luoyang. Does Buddhism still reach China someday? By sea? By some slower road? Perhaps. Historians rightly resist single points of failure. But the Buddhism that shaped hundreds of millions of lives across East Asia, the great vehicle, with its written scriptures and its serene universal face, took one specific bridge at one specific time, and the bridge had a name. Some 400 million Buddhists live in the world today, the great majority of them in East Asia. At the far end of roads, the Kushans kept open, and the inheritance runs wider than religion. The gold standard Vima struck became the monetary spine of Gupta India, which historians often call a golden age. The art of Gandhara and Mathura became the mother grammar of Buddhist art from Afghanistan to Kyoto. Even our own rediscovered knowledge of Central Asia. The Bactrian documents, the excavated cities, the coins in 1,000 museum drawers, is largely a Kushan bequest. The empire left no pyramids and no epics. It left connections, and connections are invisible precisely when they are working. Which brings us back, one last time, to where tonight began. Somewhere in a museum drawer lies a small gold coin, a king in a nomad coat, flames at his shoulders, Greek letters around him, and on the other side, a standing figure and the word Bodo. You know everything about it now. You know the flight from the Gansu corridor that put this family on the road, and the envoy who walked 13 years to find them. You know the Greek city whose alphabet circles the rim, the grandfather who unified 5 tribes, the father whose gold matched Caesar's, the king whose stone at Rabatak waited 18 centuries in a hillside. You know why the Buddha stands there, and what it cost, in miles and lifetimes, to carry that face east until it looked out from temples over Luoyang and Kyoto. 4 civilizations, pressed into 8 grams of gold, sleeping in a drawer. Most of history is like that coin. The loud empires get the shelf displays. The hinges rest in the drawers, unlabeled, holding the whole cabinet together. We are nearly at the end of our journey. Stay with me just a few minutes more, for a last look back down the whole long road. The drawer slides shut. The gold does not mind the dark. It has waited before. Every story we have followed tonight began with someone leaving home, a nation of herders leaving the Gansu corridor with everything they could carry, an envoy leaving Chang'an with a staff of authority he would hold for 13 years, a Greek named Clearchos leaving Delphi with a copy of the Maxims in his pack, monks leaving Gandhara with birch bark scrolls in their saddlebags. Knowing the road east had no end, they would live to see. None of them knew what they were building. That may be the gentlest truth this history offers. The Yuezhi were not trying to connect 4 civilizations. They were trying to survive the winter. Jiang Qian was not trying to open the Silk Road. He was trying to complete a mission that had already failed. Lokak Shima, bent over his table in Luoyang, was not trying to reshape the spiritual life of East Asia. He was trying to find a Chinese word for emptiness that would not mislead his students. History is mostly made this way, not by people who see the whole design, but by people who do their portion of the road well and hand the cargo on. And if the Kushans leave us one more gift, it is a way of seeing. We are taught to look for history's protagonists, the empires with the biggest armies and the loudest monuments. The Kushans teach you to look, instead, for the connectors, the translators, the middle people, the ones who hold doors open. Once you learn to see them in the ancient world, you begin to notice them everywhere, in every era, in every workplace, in every family. Most of what reaches us because someone in the middle carried it faithfully and asked for no credit. The Kushan Empire lasted, at its height, perhaps 3 centuries, set against Rome's span or China's. That is a short lease. But empires should be measured the way we measured this one all night, not by how long they held their ground, but by what passed through their hands while they held it. Gold passed through, and became the coinage of classical India. Art passed through, and became the face of the Buddha from Kabul to Kyoto. A teaching passed through, and became the quiet furniture of hundreds of millions of lives. In languages the Kushans never heard, in countries they never knew existed. The empire is gone. The passage endures. Somewhere tonight, in Kyoto or Seoul or Hanoi or Ohio, someone is sitting quietly in front of a calm, carved face, breathing slowly, and does not know that the road between that face and its origin runs through the passes of the Hindu Kush, past the toll houses of vanished kings. Now the road runs through you as well. That is how transmission works. It only asks to be carried a little further. One night can hold only so much. And tomorrow most of the names will blur. That is fine. If you keep a single image, keep the coin. And if you keep a single thought, keep this one. Between every great civilization and every other, there is a space on the map that the textbooks skip, and people live there. And sometimes, for a few centuries, the people who live there quietly decide what the rest of the world gets to inherit. If something in this long night stayed with you, a name, a coin, a road you want to follow deeper, tell me about it in the comments. I read them while preparing the next journey, and the best ones often decide where we go. And if this was your first night here, the fire is always lit. Long histories, told slowly, for the end of the day. This has been Ash and Empire. The fires of history burn down, but the embers keep their heat for a very long time, and we sit with them together. The road is quiet now. The last caravan is through the pass. Rest, traveller. The story is safe until morning.